Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. All right, poof. This is a stealth video. I'm doing this on Friday instead of Saturday, simply because, to be honest, my mom has Saturday off or Sunday off, and I want to go to a movie with her. So, taking doing a video early so I can spend a little bit of time with my family. All right, so got some good news, got some bad news. Good news, this is the last video of the semester. Yay! Bad news, this is the last video of the semester. So just to give an idea of where we are, where we're going. Boop. All right, so we just finished having our discussion on the counterculture with the Smothers Brothers, and I just want to be a cosmic cowboy, Edge of Tastelessness. So this week, well, I guess technically next week, seeing how I'm still doing this on Friday, we're going to have our discussion on the conservative 60s, Obey the Rules and Get Out, and the 2 episodes of All in the Family, Meeting the Bunkers, and Judging Books by Covers. That will be led by Jessica, and yeah, it'll be her. And so this week, scrolling down, basically doing the last lecture. Yeah, don't forget your Borer book review if you haven't already turned it in. Due in on the 24th. I put the links as requested for the things I'm going to use in this video on here. They're already right there. So you will just have to, if you're leading discussion, that would be Stacy and Stacy and Michael. It'll just be the other 60s and the Cultural Revolution. You do not need to talk about any of those. Sharon statement, as I meant, Sharon and Port Huron statements, they potentially will appear on your exam. I'll talk more about that on the discussion on Wednesday the 1st. All right, so yeah, that's it. That's all. Let's get this party started. Let's get it started hot. Let's get it started in here. Come on, computer. There we go. Let's get it started hot. Let's get it started in here. All right, so we're talking about endings and beginnings. Start from the beginning. I'm so funny. Endings and beginnings. So I've been trying to figure out how to wrap up the course and was struggling with how do you wrap up a decade, an idea, an ethos like the 60s. Well, came across this quote from Jim Morrison: "A generation lasts 2 or 3 years." And I mean, we kind of saw that when we were talking about the various movements that we talked about during the semester. So we've had all the movements we talked about had a 2 to 4 year real big kind of impact. They were out front for only about 2 to 4 years, and then they would either splinter or they would sort of fade away. So if we apply this to the movements, I mean, like we've talked about the entire semester, the 60s can be seen almost as a movement era, a period of time during which previously underrepresented groups come together as a movement to achieve a goal. So, for example, we have the civil rights movement, achieving political and civil rights, Black nationalism and ethnic consciousness, trying to achieve economic rights and or recognition that, hey, we actually exist. The Chicanos are here. The indigenous people are here. Women's right and gender equalization. We have the youth movement, where you have large generation of youth, the baby boom, feeling their political oaths, and even the conservative movement, trying to achieve political recognition in the political sphere and trying to gain recognition as a legitimate political ideology. Now, I would argue that the conservatives are indeed a movement, as they were an underrepresented group during an era of the liberal consensus. However, while the other movements took less time to fall apart, I would suggest that what we are seeing today in the past 4 years or so is the splintering of the conservative movement in the 21st century. So, all that being said, there was a cultural triumph of the 1960s. We still, even today, we the cultural the 60s have a large cultural imprint on American culture. And so, more than anything, it's the ethos of the 1960s, the ethos of the 60s that has permeated the American culture, with less emphasis on order and discipline and more emphasis on individuality and specialness. To give you an example, I have several friends in the States who have become so disenchanted with the system that they basically refuse to vote because, according to them, one politician is just the same as the next. I mean, we see this ethos of getting away from the system, getting away with less emphasis on order, discipline, the system. The TV show Futurama, they will have several episodes where you will have an election where you would have uh, basically the same individual, uh, albeit with a different name, up for election, and in a nice little twist that sort of leads into the 60s, in that in the end we have the head of Richard Milhouse Nixon winning the election. So, an example of this ethos, we have the people who want to conform versus those who think they're individuals or special little flowers. And but when we look at the longer lasting impact, the longer lasting triumph of the 60s, we have to look at its cultural impact. This includes its impact on TV, music, and movies. And what's kind of interesting, and we'll see this when we talk about some of the music, the 60s values, supposedly against consumerism, supposedly against capitalism, is now being used for that very same purpose. But one of the big factors in the cultural triumph of the 60s is this sense of nostalgia. And we have nostalgia in media, we have nostalgia in television, music, and movies. So in the 1980s, we have TV shows such as The Wonder Years and Quantum Leap that take more of a nostalgic look at the 60s. Now, with respect to The Wonder Years, Fred Savage is actually a producer of a new series of The Wonder Years, and I think it makes for, well, it's a good TV show to begin with, but I think it makes for fascinating viewing because it's following a middle class African American community or African American family in Birmingham, Alabama in 1968. So you're looking at, what is that, 5 years after the Birmingham campaign? The very first episode deals, or ends with, I should say, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. But going back to the original Wonder Years, it looks at the 60s through the eyes of Kevin Arnold and through the eyes of his typical social and family life between 1968 and 1973. And it's really interesting because, I mean, the new show kind of takes the same thing. So in the original Wonder Years, you have the older sister, the middle sister in this case. She would take more of she would sort of bring more of the youth aesthetic, sort of the hippie sort of mindset. She's at times very much a flower child. In the new one, the older sister of the main character, she is very much, at least trying to, outside of the eyes of her parents, read more and more and more about Black Panther ideology. So it's interesting taking different aspects and looking at it from different perspectives. So the Wonder Years set up in a frame narrative where the narrator is telling the story about past events. So think about it like the show How I Met Your Mother. So you have the narrator in the future telling a story about what happened in the past. Now, the show's theme song is a Joe Cocker cover of "A Little Help with My uh, a little help a little help from my friends," and I have a couple of links. How the first four seasons use the theme, and then we have uh, I think it was season six. I took the second one from it. Sort of shows how it kind of changes in time, and especially as every season is a year. 68, 69, 70, 71, 72. So eight season show covers an eight or 5 season show covers a 5 year period. And that show brings a big nostalgia factor to the baby boomers. And funny enough, I mean, some of this is happening today as we get reboots. Again, I mentioned the Wonder Years, but we're getting reboots in movies from TV shows in the 1980s. We had an A-Team movie. We have shows from the 90s being rebooted or trying to be rebooted. And we have kind of similar shows to the Wonder Years looking back in the 1980s, like the Goldbergs. So yeah, it's even though nostalgia isn't quite as big for us Gen Xers, 80s, 90s, it's like, yeah, whatever. We don't really have as good of a look back. I mean, you don't have a Reality Bites TV show in the 20 teens or 2020s. But because of the the largeness of the generation of the baby boomers, we do have sort of a greater nostalgia for the 1960s. The show on our right is from Quantum Leap. And Quantum Leap ran 1989 to 1993. And the premise is trapped in the past. Dr. Beckett finds himself leaping from life to life, putting things right that once went wrong, and hoping each time that his next leap will be the leap home. That is literally from the introduction for every episode of Quantum Leap. Basically, Dr. Samuel Beckett steps into a time machine that allows him to travel along his own time stream, but he's unable to control where he leaps to. And in every leap, he enters someone's body and is basically able to control their body while maintaining his own memories. Now, generally, Dr. Beckett leaps into lives that occurred during the long 60s. There are times when he leaps into the 1980s as briefly and as early as 1945. I have a link to the introduction to Quantum Leap for you to see. And again, this nostalgia factor, because, well, Beckett will occasionally leap into or meet future famous people such as Dr. Ruth Westheimer. For those of you not aware, little Jewish doctor, literally 4 foot nothing. She was on the radio, had a TV show, and was basically talking about sex in the 1980s. So Dr. Ruth, where Sam Beckett will play Scott Bakula, will play a 4 foot nothing Dr. Ruth Westheimer. Scott Bakula as Sam Beckett will play Elvis Presley. Whereas Elvis Presley, he will meet a young sax player from Hope, Arkansas at a music contest. That is, he meets Bill Clinton. Didn't happen. He leaps into the body of Buddy Holly, where he helps Buddy Holly write the song Peggy Sue. Peggy Sue, Peggy Sue, do 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 do, my Peggy Sue. Hey, it's the end of the semester. I'm allowed to go a little crazy. But most notoriously, Dr. Samuel Beckett, this is in a 1992 episode, I believe, jumps into the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is a a 2-hour episode essentially. And in the 2 episodes, written by the creator Donald P. Bellisario. This was Bellisario's attempt to sort of rebut, to sort of refute Oliver Stone's JFK that came out the previous year. And Oliver Stone in the movie JFK with Kevin Costner, back and to the left, back and to the left. For those of you who think I'm crazy, it was a JFK meme before there were memes. Oliver Stone's movie JFK came out in 1991, leaned into more conspiracy theory. And so in this 2-part episode where Samuel Beckett, Scott Bakula, is playing Lee Harvey Oswald, Beckett and Oswald start merging their minds together, and both Sam Beckett and Dean Stockton played Al. Al was a person that only Sam could see from his original time. And both Sam and Al are unsure if Sam is supposed to save John F. Kennedy or if he's supposed to unearth a conspiracy. And so in the end, Lee Harvey Oswald is revealed to be the lone assassin. Sam Beckett leaps into a Secret Service agent before the assassination. So basically, if I'm remembering correctly, Sam Beckett was in Lee Harvey Oswald's body as he was in the book depository aiming down towards motorcade. He leaps out before the shots are fired, leaps into the body of a Secret Service agent just before the assassination. And running to the car, he's unable to save JFK, but the Secret Service agent, as Sam, jumps and leaps and protects Jackie Kennedy. So we have the sense of nostalgia in television. We have the sense of nostalgia in music as well. And this is one of the areas where the nostalgia factor really kicks in. Because not only do you have classic radio stations where a fair amount of the classics come from the 60s, 70s, although really classics are now be considered hits from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Back in the day, it used to be 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and today. Now it's 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and today. But so not only do you have radio stations and classic radio stations, but modern commercials make sure plenty of the 60s music is used in their commercials, and often used to invoke a sense of nostalgia. Now, Bob Dylan, has been somewhat overused with commercials in the past 20 years. Banks in both Canada and the US have used Dylan's anthem, The Times They Are Changing. Like a Rolling Stone has been used in several commercials. And Cadillac, Pepsi, amongst others, used Dylan and their music to sell products. But one of the oddest, and I have to provide some context here. In 1965, in a 1965 press conference, a reporter asked Bob Dylan that if he ever sold out, what would he sell out to? What would he sell out for? And Dylan's response to the question was, well, ladies' garments. And so in 2007, Victoria's Secret used not just Bob Dylan's music, but Bob Dylan himself to try to sell bras and panties. And I have the commercial for you guys on UR Courses. And while people claim that Dylan sold out when he went electric, I would suggest that there is no doubt that the Dylan of the 60s would say that this modern Dylan had sold out. Well, speaking of Rolling Stone, the Rolling Stones had I Can't Get No Satisfaction, used in various commercials. And their song Paint It Black has been used in a number of video game commercials, most appropriately in the video game Call of Duty Black Ops 3. This was from about 6 years ago. Um, and the commercials for Blops 3 were fantastic. I have one of the commercials on your courses for you to see. So music, or TV, music, and movies. Because movies reliving or mythologizing the 60s started coming out as the boomers began making their mark in Hollywood. Oliver Stone is a prime example of this. Oliver Stone will relive Vietnam in the movies Platoon and Born on the 4th of July. He will explore the JFK assassination, as I mentioned, in the movie JFK with Kevin Costner, back and to the left, and took on Richard Nixon in Nixon. But what's also interesting about not just Oliver Stone, but movies in the 80s. So another prime example of this is the Rambo series. Now, many of you might just know Rambo as oh God, I'm just going to go and just shoot everybody and I'm going to win USA, USA, USA. First movie had John Rambo. This is Rambo First Blood. The first movie had John Rambo coming back from Vietnam, going to the small town to sort of give his condolences to one of the men who died, one of his friends who died in Vietnam, one of his squad mates who died in Vietnam. And it was an African American family, if I remember correctly. And a couple of things. In the first movie, John Rambo, I would say definitively, was the character was suffering from PTSD. And although it wasn't called such in the movie. And so it was not so much a movie about, it was not so much an action movie like we think of action movies today, but rather it was a thinking man's action movie where it actually explores a number of different variables about the character rather than just, oh, he's a meathead, he can kill a lot of people. And so chased out of town, and basically it's the system against John Rambo. In the movie First Blood Part 2, John Rambo refights the Vietnam War. In the movie, Rambo's in prison. His former commanding officer, a colonel in the military, comes and gets him out, says that there were POWs, MIAs, who had not come home, and they're sending Rambo into Vietnam on a rescue mission. His response after hearing what his mission is, do we get to win this time? So in movies like Rambo First Blood Part 2, movies like, what's his name? Chuck Norris, there we go. Sorry, it took me a second. Chuck Norris similarly has movies where he goes back to Vietnam and essentially refights the Vietnam War. So you have movies like Platoon, movies like Born on the 4th of July, movies like JFK, exploring aspects and experiences in the 60s. We also have sort of the other side of things. So like I said, the Rambo movies, First Blood Part 2, show this sort of split between a sort of, okay, let's delve into issues that Vietnam veterans might be experiencing, versus, okay, now let's refight the Vietnam War. Let's win this time. But the movie, the movie that I would argue that has the greatest cultural impact with respect to nostalgia, with respect to how the 60s is viewed by future generations, is 1994's Forrest Gump. Hi, my name is Forrest Gump. And both the book and the movie, the book is much different than the movie, by the way. Both the book and the movie involve Forrest Gump living and loving through key points of the long decade of the 60s. Now, Forrest Gump, got the good side of the 60s, well, except for fighting in Vietnam, where it had all sorts of rain. And Jenny, his love interest, or the let's just call her love interest, while Jenny pretty much got the bad side of the 60s, at least according to the film. So, for example, Forrest got to play for Bear Bryant in the University of Alabama football team. Jenny got to play Joan Baez's songs Naked. Forrest was part of the ping pong team that helped open up China. Jenny was the arm candy of a radical student protester. Forrest survived Hurricane Carmen and opened up a shrimping company that was very successful. While Jenny, poor Jenny, she got addicted to drugs and wanted to jump off a building. And so again, this is 1994. And the reason I mention this is to give some context, because 1980s, we have the AIDS epidemic. 1992, Magic Johnson comes out and says he has AIDS, HIV. And so the sense in 92, 93, 94 was that AIDS was a death sentence. So somebody who had AIDS is likely going to die. And the perception was, although the perception in the 1980s, AIDS was a homosexual disease. Magic Johnson, 90s, okay, other people can get it, but you have to engage in risky behavior. So it goes from, okay, it's a homosexual disease, to, okay, it's homosexuals and drug users, to now it's homosexuals, drug users, and promiscuous people. So you have this very moral sense going against people who are HIV positive. While not explicitly stated in the movie, Jenny, at the end of the movie, dies. But the implication of her death was that she died of HIV/AIDS. And because of that implication, it implies that the character of Jenny and everything that she went through, singing Joan Baez songs Naked, arm candy of a radical student protester, with this sense of she's being passed around, becoming a drug addict, and the like, her past behavior caused her to have AIDS, HIV/AIDS. So the implication, even though it's not explicitly stated, the implication is bad behavior leads to this end. Now, Forrest Gump was a touchstone movie for a lot of boomers. While for those of us outside of the generation, this is where we get, especially Generation X, especially those coming to the 60s from a place like Forrest Gump. This is where we get a fair amount of an overview of the 60s, both the good and the bad. Now, I want to end this class talking about extremism and backlash in the 1960s. And I want to talk about two events. I want to talk about Boston and buffing, Boston and busing, and the SDS and the Weather Underground. Now, we'll start with the backlash. I've mentioned some of the backlash against the movements of the 60s. For example, the Little Rock crisis in 1957, Birmingham in 1963, but the backlash was not constrained to the 60s, nor was it constrained to the South. So let's talk about white backlash to civil rights. Because remember Brown v. Board of Education mandated segregation with, quote, all deliberate speed. And we saw the backlash to the Brown decision in the South. But in the North, we have a similar movement against desegregation in education in the late 60s and early 70s. And one of the best examples of this occurs in the supposedly liberal Massachusetts, in Boston, where we have a white uproar over mandated busing between 1974 and busing will end in 1988. Now, to deal with integrating their schools, Massachusetts passed the Racial Imbalance Act in 1965, in which the Racial Imbalance Act of 1965 mandated that segregated schools either desegregate or they risk losing state funding to these schools. And so according to this legislation, racial imbalance, it said, quote, racial imbalance shall be deemed to exist where the percent of non-white students in any public school is in excess of 50% of the total number of students in each school. So any school that had 50% plus one non-white student was considered to be a racially imbalanced school. And therefore, the state funding going to the school was at risk. Now, according to studies undertaken by the state, a majority of the racially imbalanced schools, 44 out of 55 total unbalanced schools, were in Boston, Massachusetts. And so, as a result of a lawsuit filed by the NAACP against the Boston School District, the federal judiciary stepped in to implement desegregation. The NAACP accused the Boston School District of de facto segregation through how the school district was set up. Because Boston, like most cities, had a feeder system into their high schools. You went into an elementary school, that elementary fed into a number of middle or junior high schools. Those middle or junior high schools fed into a number of high schools. So students would enter the high schools either from middle school, that is grade 6 to 8, and would feed into a high school from grade 9 to grade 12, or they would feed in from a junior high school, grade 6 to 9, that would feed into a high school from grade 10 to 12. So they had two different ways to sort of feed into high schools. The problem was that middle schools tended to be in majority African American neighborhoods, which meant that the middle schools, predominantly African American, would feed into high schools that were predominantly African American as well, while the junior highs tended to be in majority white schools. So junior highs would feed into high schools, making them majority white. And so this feeder system not only led to a de facto segregated school system, but intense overcrowding at white high schools, where the district chose to build portable classrooms rather than shifting students to other majority Black high schools. So for example, one all-white high school, South Boston High, was over capacity by about 700 students, while a majority African American high school, Roxbury High, which was only about 15 minutes away, was under capacity by 500 students. So rather than sending students to a school that had room, the school district decided we're just going to keep building portable classrooms. And so it was found that the Boston School District was de facto segregated. And so the federal judge appointed to the case, Judge Wendell Garrity, 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 ordered the Boston School District to follow the state law and to submit and implement a desegregation plan, or he would be forced to issue desegregation orders and implement it himself. So he gave the Boston School District an opportunity to fix this problem. And so when the Boston School Committee refused to comply, Garrity followed through. He issued a desegregation order that involved busing for the public school system. That last part is going to be important, the public school system. And so we have education not transfer. So these juniors have no rights. We'll talk about juniors in a second. Surrender Garrity, you made I would assume, a mistake. Don't transport our neighborhood, educate our neighborhood kids. Now, I mentioned juniors just now, because part of the desegregation ruling was that schools be actually desegregated. And this involved, in some cases, busing African American students from one school to another and vice versa for white students. So going back to our example of South Boston and Roxbury High Schools, only 15 minutes apart, Garrity ordered the entire junior class, that is all the grade 11s of South Boston, approximately 500 students, ordered that they be transferred to Roxbury, while half of the sophomore, that is grade 10 class of each school, would attend the opposite number. So half of the grade 10s of Roxbury would transfer over to South Boston and vice versa. While the senior class, that is the grade 12s of each school, would decide for themselves which school they would attend. The students affected would be bused to their new school. Now, this was intended to ensure that schools had more than a token black or token white representation. The busing issue became a major issue, a major problem amongst the lower and working white classes of Boston. These whites resented the fact that the desegregation order predominantly affected them and not the upper classes in the suburbs, because this was a public school desegregation order. The upper classes in the suburbs, those are the ones who could afford the private schools. So they did not have to desegregate their private schools because it's not part and parcel of the public school system. And so this resentment over being bused also allowed lower and middle class whites to express their racism without being racist. So rather than saying, I don't want my child going to this school with that child, the argument often went, why should I bus my child a half an hour away or 15 minutes away when there is a closer school? And so we have an organization that is created called Restore Our Alienated Rights. Restore Our Alienated Rights, ROAR, as in roar. This was formed by Louise Day Hicks, Hicks. Louise Day Hicks was a member of the Boston School Committee. ROAR was an anti-integration movement designed to oppose mandated busing. And ROAR attempted to use direct action based off the civil rights movement to prevent the implementation of busing. It was not successful. Early on, as we see here, Hicks and others engaged in marches through South Boston, protesting against the integration order. They organized sit-ins of school buildings and government offices and held protests in front of homes of prominent Bostonians whose children were not being bused, including Senator Ted Kennedy. Now, while their unsuccessful attempts to prevent busing in Boston, or with their unsuccessful attempts to prevent busing in Boston, Roar began losing steam, and they began losing support, and Hicks herself was unsuccessful in being reelected to the school board in 1977. Now, as we can see here, things were not always peaceful in the protest. Between 1974 and 1976, you have 40 incidents, in some cases student-on-student violence, in other cases almost full-blown riots over this issue of busing. So again, this backlash was not limited to the South. It was not like, oh, the South has all the problems, the North and the West are racial utopias. There were problems throughout the United States. Which brings us to extremism in the 60s. And so we've seen a little bit of this, but what happens when movements start breaking apart or start going too far? Well, we find that these movements either reorient and focus on new goals, or split apart as factions fight against each other over the, quote, true legacy of the movement. While most of the radicals of the 1960s grow up and join the system, see, for example, Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda actually would go to Vietnam, would go to North Vietnam and visit there, which gave her the moniker, gave her the nickname Hanoi Jane. Yet by the 1980s, she was jazzercising and married to Ted Turner. There were those who continued to fight the good fight, as they saw it. And one of the groups that I want to focus on going too far is the student movement and the New Left. Because we have from the SDS, from the Students for the Democratic Society, we have an organization called the Weather Underground. We'll get to that in a second. Now, the Weather Underground was a splinter group from the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. The Weather Underground, it's an active organization operated from 1969 to 1973. This splinter group will take over leadership of the national SDS in 1969. And once they take over the leadership, they effectively disband the organization. Because members of the SDS, members of the Weather Underground, felt that nonviolent resistance that typified the civil rights movement and the early New Left simply was not working. And they called for a shift in policy towards direct action. In a sense, they're shifting back towards the old left mode of operation with direct action. Now, the Weatherman, they issued what they called the Weatherman Manifesto. The official title was, the official manifesto was entitled, quote, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." Hence their nickname, the Weathermen. Entitled this after a line from a Bob Dylan song. The Weatherman Manifesto was written by Bernardine Dohrn, Dohrn, John Jacobs, Bill Ayers, Ayers, Jeff Jones, and others. And it was enunciated, it was distributed at the last real SDS National Convention in June 1969. So Dohrn and others take over leadership positions, and they issue this Weatherman Manifesto. And the ideology set out by the Weatherman Manifesto is rather Leninist in its orientation, not communist, but rather Leninist. The Weathermen believed that the main confrontation in the world was quote, between American imperialism and the national liberation struggles against it. So the Weathermen set themselves up as part of the group with the national liberation struggles. For the Weather Underground, their goal was, quote, the destruction of US imperialism and the achievement of a classless world. World communism struggle within the the destruction of US imperialism and the achievement of a classless world. World communism. They further say that, quote, the struggle within the US will be a vital part of this process, but when the revolution triumphs in the US, it will have been made by the people of the whole world. In the words of John Jacobs, one of the writers of the Weather Manifesto, the Weather Underground wanted to, quote, bring the war home. And so 6 months after they issue the manifesto, it was decided that the leaders of the Weather Underground would go underground and start engaging in violent, direct action against the United States. May 1970. Actually, I'm going to get back to this for a second. Because in March 1970, I want to talk about this first. The Greenwich Village townhouse explosion, March 6, 1970. Now, before I need to talk about definitions. I just want to quickly talk about definitions for a second, particularly the definition of terrorism, because a political science once said that trying to define terrorism is just like trying to nail Jello to a wall. There are 100 different definitions of what terrorism is. Most historians and political scientists agree that terror and terrorist activities have two key components. One is the use of fear and violence. Two, to achieve a specific political or ideological goal. So the use of fear and violence to achieve a specific political or ideological goal. And more often than not, a small group is using terror to coerce action from a larger group. For example, hijacking an airliner to trade passengers for so-called political prisoners held by another country. The activities that the Weather Underground engaged in are certainly classified as domestic terrorism. So we're going to talk about the Greenwich townhouse explosion. Then we're going to go back and talk about a communique that they issue with regards to terrorism. So the Greenwich Village townhouse explosion, March 6, 1970. 5 members of the New York branch of the Weather Underground were at the family townhouse of Weather Underground member Kathleen Wilkerson, Wilkerson, attempting to craft bombs. Shortly before noon on 6 March 1970, an explosion ripped through the Wilkerson townhouse. Theodore Gould, one of the leaders of the Columbia Occupy movement, Diana Oughton, Oughton, a leader at the 1969 SDS convention, Terry Robbins, a leader of the Kent State protests in 1968, Kathy Boudin, Boudin, and Wilkerson were at the townhouse. Gould, Oughton, and Robbins were all immediately killed in the explosion, while Wilkerson and Boudin were injured but survived. Investigators of, here are some pictures that would be Gould, and I believe that would be Oughton here. That's Dustin Hoffman, by the way. He lived in Greenwich Village. He lived not too far from the Wilkerson townhouse. Investigators combed through the wreckage of the building and turned up what essentially was a bomb-making factory for the New York Weather Underground. For instance, they found a 37 millimeter anti-tank artillery shell, 57 sticks of dynamite, 4 complete pipe bombs, and several alarm clocks that were turned into timers for the bombs. Now, investigators suggest that the amateur bomb makers they made a mistake in putting together one of the explosives. They suggest that they connected a blasting cap to the dynamite and then accidentally completed an electrical circuit, which basically made the device go off prematurely. The explosion was augmented by the ignition of natural gas that was used to heat and fuel the townhouse. The 2 survivors, Wilkerson and Boudin, were indicted for unlawful possession of dynamite, but went underground and evaded capture for the better part of a decade. Now, this took place March 6, 1970. In May 1970, the Weather Underground issues a communique via an audio tape to the New York Times. They recorded a communication on an audio tape, sent it to the New York Times. That essentially was a declaration of war by the Weather Underground against the government of the United States, setting up an us versus them mentality with the Weather Underground as an organization against the United States and fascism. The communique said, quote, there are several hundred members of the Weather Underground, and some of them face more years in jail than the 50,000 deserters and draft dodgers now in Canada. Many of them are coming back to join us in the underground, or to return to the man's army and tear it up from the inside, along with those who never left. They continue. Freaks, quote, freaks are revolutionaries and revolutionaries are freaks. If you want to find us, this is where we are. This is where we are. In every tribe, commune, dormitory, farm, house, barracks, and townhouse, going back to New York, and townhouse where kids are making love, smoking dope, and loading guns. Fugitives from American justice are free to go. They spelt American Amerikan. Sort of this idea, and you sort of see it today. You sort of see it continued through the Black Power movement, but it's an idea that continues today, especially when talking about the racist nature of the system. Amerikan. This idea, the idea they're trying to provide is a connection to the KKK, a connection to the racism of the KKK, the anti-Black sentiment of the KKK, and they're arguing by even the spelling that this is part and parcel of the American system and the American government. Again, this was issued in May 1970, so they're setting up their targets. And they say, quote, within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American justice. American spelled with a K again. This is a way we celebrate the example of Eldridge Cleaver and H. Rap Brown and all Black revolutionaries who first inspired us by their fight behind enemy lines for the liberation of their people. Never again will they fight alone. They go on and say the Weathermen were, quote, adopting the classic guerrilla strategy of the Viet Cong and the urban guerrilla strategy of the Tupamaros, an urban South American terrorist group, to our own situation here in the most technologically advanced country in the world. So they issued this in May 1970 to sort of explain why they were building bombs. So May 1970, they said in 14 days, we will go and attack a target. We'll get to him in a second. May 10th, 1970, they bomb the National Guard headquarters. So they follow through with their promise. A month later, June 9th, 1970, they bomb the New York City headquarters, New York City Police headquarters as well. And then 4 months later, you have courthouse bombings in Marin, California, Queens, New York, and Long Island, New York. So the Weather Underground starting to follow through with their threats. Now, the Weather Underground is also involved in Timothy Leary's escape from prison, September 15, 1970. Now we'll get to Leary. Expand your mind, man. Turn on, tune in, drop out. Timothy Leary, the guru of LSD, had been arrested in both 1965 and 1968 for possession of marijuana. But through a series of legal challenges, was not sentenced until 1970. Leary is sentenced for possession under California law to 20 years of prison for possession of marijuana. Now, every inmate that goes into the California penal system was given a series of psychological tests to determine the appropriate work detail for the inmate. Now, the problem for the state of California was Leary had himself designed some of these psychological tests. And so when he had to take some of his own tests, he answered them in such a way that it would ensure that he would be sent to a minimum security facility where he would be allowed to work as a gardener. And so what ends up happening? Well, Leary ends up simply walking away from the facility, leaving a note for the authorities on his bed, essentially taunting them. Now, the Weather Underground comes into the picture when they accept a $25,000 payment from an organization called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. And they accept this $25,000 to smuggle Leary and his wife out of the country and to deliver him to Eldridge Cleaver, the leader of the Black Panther government in exile based in Algeria. So they follow through, they get Leary out of the country, get him to Algeria. But while those are okay, we accidentally blew ourselves up. Oh, we helped smuggle Leary out of the country. Those are kind of okay. The Weather Underground have a sustained bombing campaign for about 5 years, between 1970 and 1975. The Weather Underground would engage in a bombing campaign against the government of the United States for the next 5 years or so. Most of the targets are either part of the military-industrial complex. Remember, they're trying to, quote, bring the war home, or they're targets important to the Weather Underground and their allies, either real allies or imagined allies. So we have targets like the National Guard headquarters, attacking the government. We have a bombing of the U.S. Army base in San Francisco on 25 July 1970, attacking the government. On the 1st of March 1971, the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., seat of government, bombed. May 1972, the Pentagon bombed. 29 January 1975, State Department, government, bombed. The New York Police Headquarters, June 9, 1970, that is where the investigation into the Greenwich bombing was headquartered, bombed. Courthouses in Marin, California, Queens, New York, and Long Island, New York. Various members of either the Weather Underground or the Black Panthers or other real or imagined allies of the Weather Underground. That's where they were being tried, bombed. September 17th, 1971, you have the New York Department of Corrections in Albany, New York, bombed by the Weather Underground in retaliation for New York's retaking of the Attica prison and the subsequent cover-up. For the most part, what would happen, it's a bomb, like in the State Department or wherever, would be secreted into a bathroom. And if you've ever been into a government building, there are a lot of bathrooms there. And shortly before, a warning would be phoned in. Hey, we have a bomb planted in one of your bathrooms. Good luck finding it, pigs. So the authorities have the option of either evacuating areas around the bathrooms or trying to find the bombs. They often would try to do both, but they would often not have time to do both. So here are a couple of examples of the after effects of the bombing. So, I mean, the bombings happened. They were not designed to be lethal. There were injuries, not that many deaths. But after 1975, many in the leadership of the Weather Underground start re-emerging and start reintegrating into society. In part because much of the evidence collected by the government against the Weather Underground was collected illegally. Much of it was done through COINTELPRO, bugs. For example, the Chicago 8 trial was eventually declared a mistrial because it was found out that the prosecution planted bugs in the defense offices with the knowledge of the judge. So illegal evidence, or the government was unwilling to reveal their source. So the leaders felt comfortable re-emerging above ground. And if they served any jail time, it was rather limited at the most. But that, as they say, is that. So I'm going to end here. We still have our discussions for the next couple of weeks, but this will be the last video. So for the last time in this class, or at least on video, go forth, slay dragons, and I won't see you in the next video. I will see you guys on Wednesday, however, so see you guys then. All right, bye.